Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about organized labor. Okay, now not simply just people coming together and doing so in an organized way, we're actually talking about workers. And so as appropriately termed, this lesson is called a labor of love. Okay, what we're looking at here today is a couple of things. So here's kind of our agenda. I'm going to skip over the first activity because I assume that you guys can do that yourself. Okay, and I'm really going to focus here on the mini lesson as the focus of this video. Okay, and so what is this lesson trying to achieve? Well, we're going to look at the tactics employed by labor, and we're going to look at were they effective? Okay, and we're also going to look later, and you guys will do this in your own four-way Venn diagram, comparing and contrasting the aims of four different labor organizations. Okay, they also have some different styles too, which we can also take a look at in terms of sizing them up to each other. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and skip over this activity. It's called Breaking Beech Grove. Okay, and I'm going to let you guys handle that. Alrighty. So there were questions in here. I guess we can probably use these also to kind of frame our debate for the mini lesson as well. So we're going to look at things such as what gender, age, class should you include in a particular labor movement. Okay, and you'll find out here later that certain groups are very, very particular as to, do they want skilled labor, do they want unskilled labor, are they going to allow females, are they going to allow African Americans to be a part of the labor union, or is including those groups a liability, or is it a strength? Different labor organizations also have different philosophies and goals in terms of how they're going to achieve particular objectives. So for example, if they want to raise wages, is a strike going to be the most effective thing? Is it going to be assassinating management? Is it going to be basically a work line slowdown, something like that? Okay, and so then we can debate whether or not those particular things had good outcomes. And so what we're going to do in this mini lesson is look at 3 strikes. Okay, so like baseball, and you're going to see here that the end result for labor is not very good. It just simply does not go well in terms of basically over this period. Okay, what generally happens is that we do see the rise of organized labor, but then it is you can clearly see a decision that's made kind of from both a national level and then also from an industrial level about how these labor organizations are going to be treated. Okay, and that's why we say, and labor's out. Alrighty, so our essential questions that we're going to be digging into. Why do certain tactics of labor result in positive or negative outcomes? And then how do outside forces or factors influence the power of labor? Okay, so we're going to talk about some of those outside things as well. Okay, so the first strike that we're going to look at. Okay, now if you're not familiar with what a strike is, it's basically when workers walk off the job. Okay, they refuse to work. And so when labor in the United States, again, we're in that period of industrialization. We've had massive numbers of immigrants moving into the country from Southern and Eastern European countries. Labor realizes, and we kind of talked about this last lesson, right, that as industry tries to become more and more efficient, that they pretty much get treated worse and worse. Okay, and so the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 is the first actual strike that we're going to take a look at. So this was the first, what we could say, interstate strike in American history, so meaning that it takes place in multiple states simultaneously. So basically what happens in this here is that there's a panic in 1873. We've learned about panics before, like the Panic of 1837. Okay, and rail lines cut wages. Okay, now in then 1877, we give it a few years, there's even more cuts to railroad workers' wages. And in one particular town in Martinsburg, West Virginia, workers there begin a strike. Now, basically what happens from this point is that strikes then begin popping up all over the place. However, the thing about these strikes is that they're not coordinated. Basically, news from this one strike spreads, and different groups, again, not affiliated with each other, kind of get the same idea. Basically, what happens from this is that over 100 people die in these related incidents kind of going around the country, and how it ends is that federal troops come in and put down the riots, and those workers go back to work. Okay, now, again, please note that federal troops here were used, so we're talking about national U.S. troops used to put down workers striking. Okay, and anytime that a government is going to take a position on that, that's going to be a really, really big deal. Okay, so tactics that these workers use. Okay, yes. Before the federal troops move in and crush them on all these different strikes, we have them walking off the job. They block tracks. They loot locomotive, basically building and manufacturing areas. There's mobs, torching, arson, those kind of things. Okay, so that's what they do. Now, the significance of this strike is, again, as we said, notice the lack of organization. There's no coordination between any of these groups. And what unions take out of this is like, okay, if we're going to make a strike actually meaningful and actually make something happen, that means that we need to be organized. Like, we have to do something in unison to have power. Okay. Now, also what it does, and this is another big thing, is for those people like the U.S. government or capitalists and businesses, they see these strikes and they're like, whoa, if this was more coordinated, this could be really, really dangerous. And they start thinking along the lines of, oh, what if workers start getting together and actually doing this kind of thing? And so both in the public and in the business area, people begin to fear like the actual power that labor might have in terms of like doing tactics like these, or fundamentally changing how the economy works. Okay, and so here you can see a picture of it. Yes, burning, looting, arson, tearing up stuff. It's not a fun time, unless you're part of the mob, right? Then it's very fun. Okay, so we cannot discuss though organized labor and striking without talking about the Homestead Strike. Okay, so what basically happens in this? Okay, now again, we've talked about Andrew Carnegie in the last lesson, but this is a great example of the ties and the clashes that happen between capitalists and then the workers who work for them. Okay, so this is a strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Okay, if you'd like to learn more about it, like the actual incidents here, you can click in this video down here. It's a pretty good reinterpretation, but I'm just going to go over the basics here. Okay, this is between a local union, okay, and Andrew Carnegie's gigantic trust, U.S. Steel. Now, Andrew Carnegie, to be fair to him, is actually not really in command at the time. It's one of his basically local subordinates. Okay, and what happens here is that workers begin to strike. They want they basically walk off the job. They want to be they want better pay and a couple other things. And then what actually happens from this, okay, is really, really interesting. So Andrew Carnegie's lieutenant at the time, when the workers start to strike, he actually keeps them out of the factory. He doesn't allow them to work or make any wages whatsoever. Okay, now what we call these attempts is we call them sometimes like a lockout. And basically what he does is he builds a 12-foot wall all the way around the plant. He hires Pinkertons. Okay, now if you're not familiar with what a Pinkerton is, this was like a private detective agency that you could basically hire, and oftentimes the Pinkerton agents and people like that were used to basically break up strikes. And they use Pinkertons to protect it, and then what they finally do is they call in what are called scabs, which are oftentimes extremely underpaid workers to come in and take the jobs of the people who are in the factory. And that's when things just go completely south. And if you want to see what happens, it gets really, really nasty. There's attempted assassinations on management. There's mobs. There's a whole lot of gunfire. It gets really, really nasty. Okay, now basically from this incident, okay, there's two large things that happen. This is the first of two incidents. The next one's coming here in a second. That kind of really drastically affects the momentum that labor had going even earlier. Okay, and the larger, I guess you could also say, significance is that when the U.S. government looks at this incident, okay, they see the Pinkertons being hired by Andrew Carnegie. They back up Andrew Carnegie. They don't come to the defense of the workers. They're committed to corporate capitalism over labor, okay, because eventually what happens is that federal troops also come in and help restore order after the Homestead Strike begins, and Pinkerton detectives and scabs and all this basically gigantic chaos breaks out. Okay, and so the U.S. government backs Carnegie up, and so we're kind of starting to see this trend here that we see that the U.S. government's more, at least committed on face value to corporations' interests than labor's interests. Okay, so again, tactics, strikes, militias, attempted assassination, and management. It's a gigantic mess, and I would really encourage you again to go watch it down here. It's also got a couple of interpretations that will kind of change your view on it as well. Okay, now. The last one that we're going to talk about is the Pullman Strike, okay, of 1894. Now, if you've not heard of Pullman, Pullman cars, they used to be around even pretty recently as of 2017, but Pullman cars are basically really, really nice luxury railroad cars, okay, and so Pullman was a city in Illinois, I believe. Is that? I'll have to double check that. Yeah, Pullman, Illinois, Pullman is actually a really cool example of something that we talked in last class, which is called vertical integration. And that's where a business literally owns like every step of the production process. Okay, so in Pullman, Illinois, okay, and I believe George Pullman was the guy's name. Kids were educated in Pullman schools. They bought what they needed for every day at the Pullman grocery store. The quote that I always remember when I read books about this was like, "Our children will be born in a Pullman hospital, they will go to Pullman schools, and when they die, they will go to Pullman hell," because everything was so vertically integrated that everything they did was about that. Okay, now to explain this a little bit further, George Pullman is extremely, extremely harsh on his workers and basically keeps them in kind of a near debt status in order to keep them working for him. Okay, because again, it really wasn't a choice at this time. If you stop working, you just don't make it. Okay, and so what happens here? Okay, well, in 1893, there's another panic. Okay, and these railway cars, they still need to be built because there's still people riding trains, and so Pullman cuts wages anywhere from 25 to 40%. Okay, now what happened also during this time, and again, we're 30 years now after the Civil War, is that railroads have become the dominant method of transportation in the United States. Okay, and so by this time, there had been so many railroad workers that there actually was now an American Railway Union. Okay, this was founded by actually a Hoosier. His name is Eugene V. Debs. Okay, and he's actually from Terre Haute. His house is still there. You can go visit it today, although it's not in the best condition. Now, Eugene V. Debs is a super significant individual. Okay, he will go on to run for president in 1912, but he is, and he does eventually become the first openly socialist candidate for the presidency. And we'll talk about what that means later. Just for now, know that he's the leader of this strike that happens. Okay, and so what happens? Well, Eugene V. Debs helps lead it, and he and the union basically shut down nearly all the railroads in the United States, basically across the 27 states that existed at the time. Okay, now from what happens at this, okay, again, this is in one city, okay, that everything gets started out, but then it spreads to now the entire nation. The question is, though, is like, again, who's the U.S. government going to support? Is it going to support these railway workers who are underpaid and or now it's like spread to a more national issue? Or are you going to keep the railroads going? And what the U.S. government decides is that the reason that they give is that the mail has to be delivered, right? And so you think like, wait, mail? Like, yeah, like mail was delivered by railroads at this time. And if you're blocking mail from being delivered, that is a federal issue. And so the U.S. government says, you cannot strike because the mail has to get going where it's going. And the U.S. government uses that reasoning, and it uses federal troops to put down the strike. Okay, and so from this point, then we kind of can pull a couple things out, right? So yes, strikes. Yes, the American Railway Union also does take over some Pullman and railroad property. They actually kind of do like an Occupy Wall Street kind of thing. But there's a couple like big lessons that we can pull out of this. And the first is that the U.S. government uses not only troops and force to back the Pullman and the railway industries, but also it uses something called antitrust laws against the strikers. Okay, now what a trust law was basically, we start to kind of see them at this time, was there were some individuals the public being concerned that certain trusts were becoming way too powerful. Now, what's actually ironic about this is that these antitrust laws were used against the workers who, in this case, the U.S. government thought were too powerful. So it's kind of a really ironic moment. Now, the bigger kind of things that we can also pull out of this is that pretty much this is the moment where it completely dooms the momentum of labor, because if you can't succeed in a big national strike that involves like something as fundamental as transportation, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to change or do something that's of equal significance or even more significant than that. Okay. The one other thing that we can say about this as well is that the leader of this strike, Eugene V. Debs, he's actually thrown in prison here for a number of years, and he dives even deeper into socialism. And so when the election in the year of 1912 comes around, Eugene V. Debs will actually run as the socialist candidate for president, and will get the most votes actually of any, I think it's either of any third party or of any socialist candidate ever in the United States up until that time. So kind of a big incidental thing. Okay, so there you go. Again, I know that was a little long-winded, but sometimes these strikes are complicated and it's kind of difficult to kind of tease out the significance. Okay, so again, looking back at that, can you explain the tactics that labor was trying to use, and then can you also evaluate were or were not they effective? Okay, and we also talked about some significance things in there as well. Alrighty, so I think you guys can then finish up the rest of this lesson. It's not too complicated. We have 4 labor organizations here they're going to look at. So that's the American Federation of Labor, also known as the AFL, and then later as the AFL-CIO, the Farmers Alliance, the Grange, and then the Knights of Labor. Okay, and you'll find that the Grange is like the earlier version of the Farmers Alliance. Okay, so what you're going to be doing here, okay, is either with a physical worksheet or a digital one. It's up in the right-hand corner over there. You can, or you're going to do a 4-way compare-contrast. Okay, so again, refer to the letters that are in each box. That way you know what to do. And in terms of what you are comparing and contrasting, similarities and differences between the 4 labor organizations, and if you can, go beyond the obvious. So you could look at spicy. You can also go back to these questions earlier, right here, and we talked about like some different things that different organizations are going to try to accomplish, or different criteria they have for joining. Those would all be really, really good things to compare and contrast in that. Okay, so until then, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.